Hi, my name is Ravi. I'll do a set of videos on microeconomics. I'll start with this first video, which is on market mechanisms and allocation of resources. So one of the questions that we ask is, how do resources get allocated in a market-based society? And what I'd like you to think about is that the rules of the game will very much determine the allocation of resources. And one of my favorite games to play with my students for many times has been a simulation where I think about sellers that have different cost of producing the goods. So I'm giving you those sellers in ascending order, and that's the cost of producing. So you could see here that this seller one is a low cost producer. Seller four, seller six is a really high cost producer. And then you have some buyers. And let's say that this is their maximum willingness to pay or the marginal benefit that they will get in monetary terms of purchasing the product, right? So say, for example, I'll do this again in ascending order. 16, seller 2 will get a benefit, seller 3 will get a benefit of £22 for receiving that product. And we have seller 4, 26, seller 5, 35, and seller 640. Now, it's important that in markets where you might have now on the seller side and the buyer side, you might have millions of people kind of interacting together. They don't actually share this information. So this is all private information. So when I play this game when I've played this game with my students in the past, I've only given them a very simple direction. You're a seller. Your cost is 5. So don't sell for anything less than that if you're seller 1, and try to maximize your profits. And my question to you is to think about for a moment, what do you think will happen if you put in a room a bunch of sellers and a bunch of buyers? You put them in different corners so that it's very clear who the sellers are and who the buyers are, but they can still communicate and scream at one another. And you also tell them you have 2 minutes to negotiate. Will negotiation skills really matter at that stage? What will sell? How many units will sell? At what price will sell? If you think about this, this is quite a remarkable problem, okay? And how should one think about allocation of resources under such circumstances? I encourage you to pause the video and think about that for a second. It's a phenomenally difficult problem if you don't have the right tools to actually think about. This problem, I'll give you one way how you could analyze this problem. And I actually like to, whenever I do this, I like to come up with some predictions for my students. And then we look back, and I usually write this prediction in advance, and I'm going to give you those predictions again here. So here's my predictions, which happens before the game and unbeknownst to the students. So I write this somewhere else here. So the price will be around 20 with a range between 18 to 22 covering most, if not all the prices. The seller 23 and 28, so these guys here are not going to sell, okay? And the higher valuation buyers will mostly be matched with low-cost producers. Okay, these are three predictions that we can actually test in a classroom. Now, these predictions are quite restrictive, right? Because if you think about it, the price could also be, $6, right? And the price could also be $39, right? And if it's $6, seller one would be willing to sell. And if it's $39, buyer six would be willing to buy in the margin. And I'm restricting the price to being somewhere between 18 and 22. Okay? So how do I go about doing this? Well, I'm using a model of demand and supply. So I'm using an abstract model, and microeconomics is about using these abstract models to try and give us some predictions that are useful. So in a microeconomics course, what we're hoping to do is to take some models, some abstract models, and turn them into something that's useful, right? That allows us to make certain predictions. So the analysis here is actually very simple. I take those numbers for the sellers, and I effectively create a supply curve depending on, so the price is 5, there's only a single seller. If the price is 8, there's two sellers. And similarly, I can do a demand curve for the buyer, right? If the price is very high at 40, we're only going to have one interested buyer. And you could see here that the equilibrium price is going to be somewhere between 18 to 22. Okay. Um, At least that's a prediction. Now, what will happen in the real world once these people actually sit down and start screaming at one another different prices? Well, I've done this many time over the years, and it's really remarkable, right? How close those prices are to the 18 and 22 range. It's quite remarkable that these two sellers here and these two buyers here almost always don't get to buy. And what's even more remarkable is that while this happens with a little bit less predictability. Um, the high valuation buyers tend to quickly to match with low cost producers at some equilibrium price. Um, so in a nutshell, what you have here is a very abstract model of demand supply. Um, a table that you could all understand. You have some sellers with some, cost of production. They don't want to sell for less because they would be make a loss. They would make a loss. You have some buyers with some willingness to pay. They wouldn't pay more than that because otherwise they would be making a loss. I've restricted this to be a single unit seller and a single unit buyer, but I'll link in the description a video at Stanford University. Well, you have a double-sided auction where you have multiple buyers, multiple sellers, potentially wanting to buy multiple things. And it's again remarkable how well it looks. But if you try to follow that video, you'll see that the market is really, really messy. And you might not even be able to follow what's going on. And it's quite remarkable that the results of this abstract model, how good it is at predicting what will happen. Finally, I want to close with this idea of Pareto efficiency. If you actually sum up all of these differences between the willingness to pay and the costs, it also turns out that this market mechanism maximizes these differences in effectively in value. So the market is creating value. If those people were not matched to buy and sell, it would create value. Okay. Now, it's also really interesting to discuss the ideas of equities, right? Imagine that what we're selling here is housing, right? So these sellers are not selling their homes, and these buyers here are homeless, okay? They would rather prefer to be homeless rather than purchase something because the market equilibrium price is too high, okay? So a centralized planner might come and say, no, 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 this doesn't have to work this way. Look, I can match seller one with buyer one at some price between 5 to 10. I could match this two together. I can match this two together. Actually, everyone could have a home, right? Um, I'll give you a little bit as a homework if you like. Um, Assume that you force the market to transact in this way. So seller one with buyer one, seller two with buyer two, and so on. Calculate the surplus that is being created. You will notice that that total surplus is smaller than the surplus that the market creates here. All right. So this market setup does not care about equity. It cares about efficiency to maximize the surplus that is being created. I hope you find this video helpful. Stay tuned for more.